Good evening and welcome to Bond-tober. Tonight we're going to be talking about one of the absolute big ones, the top 10 best James Bond films of all time. We're going to start off with the dishonorable mentions this time because I want to go from negative to positive throughout the rest of the film. So let's start off with what I like to call the unholy trinity of James Bond. Diamonds Are Forever. Yeesh. This movie is just, like I said in my review, just very tacky and ultimately very forgettable. And you remember some things from the movie, but not for the right reasons. Sean Connery is very lackadaisical in his performance as Bond. Tiffany Case, as I said in one of my previous videos, is one of the worst James Bond girls of all time. Charles Gray as Blofeld is not very good. And the overall feel of the film is just kind of relentlessly tacky and overly campy, and there's only so much camp I can really take from a film. Like even intended camp, I sometimes have a little difficult time with it. In this case, the camp was completely over the top in the absolute worst way.
Well, 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 look what the cat dragged in.
Right.
But there are two other films that are worse than Diamonds Are Forever, if you can believe it. And on with the next. The Man with the Golden Gun. Oof. Even thinking about The Man with the Golden Gun makes me feel somewhat unclean. It's just one of the most dismal... depressing, dreary entries in the whole series, if not the most. You know, Roger Moore had done very well in Live and Let Die, but man, was he regressed so badly by the filmmakers because they so really, truly, desperately wanted him to be Sean Connery instead of Roger Moore. And as we'll see in my upcoming video, that kind of hurt my relationship with Roger Moore, and it took a long time for him to get back in good standing with me. Also, such a waste of a great actor with Christopher Lee as Scaramanga, even though I think he was great. And it's just, I don't know, guys. I just couldn't see myself liking this film again, and sure enough, on this rewatch, it was just as painful the second time around. The pillow got a lot of use, and I won't do it again on camera, but believe me, I really needed it. Quantum of Solace.
No.
Cheers to the absolute worst James Bond film there is. Quantum of Solace is just such a weird, pathetic mess that just results from overly confident filmmakers thinking that they were just going to buck the system completely and try to make it more real, and in a sense make it more of a Jason Bourne film, which that was such a wrong approach for James Bond. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with taking notes and such from films like Jason Bourne and all that, because they were kind of seen as the modern day James Bond films, along with other films coming out at the time. The problem was, again, not really the fault of the filmmakers, because the writer strike was going on. They couldn't ask for a better screenplay for it, and Daniel Craig and director Mark Forster had to fill in a lot of the gaps themselves just to get the next day shot and get things ready. So I want to be kind to it in that regard, as I understand it wasn't entirely their fault. However, with the way that the script was developed initially and the way they tried to fit it together in editing, it just doesn't work. And the editing is some of the absolute worst I have ever seen in a motion picture. I got seasick again watching it. And are there positives to this film? Yes, there's Olga Kurylenko. I thought she was really good. David Arnold's score is just wonderful, particularly how he scores the final scene. But other than that, it's a bore. It's a absolute bore, a snooze fest. And as I've said before, one of the absolute worst mistakes a Bond film can make is bore me. And this one is just the king of it. But now we get to move on to more greener pastures with the honorable mentions. No Time to Die. As I said in my final episode from last year, No Time to Die's first half contains some of the absolute best James Bond you'll ever see. It has all the right elements. It has a unique angle. It has risks being taken. But unfortunately, there was a critical point in the story, and I can say it's the forest fight after Bond rediscovers Madeline and discovers Mathilde. And that's when the movie goes from being really on its toes and fresh and original to just becoming run-of-the-mill and then ultimately a disappointing finale, and has probably the most controversial decision in a James Bond film next to On Her Majesty's Secret Service, which is the death of James Bond himself, which I think was a push from both Daniel Craig and the producers to give his Bond more of a unique send-off, which I understand because each and every Bond before did not have a very good send-off. Their final film was often considered their worst. But overall, upon this rewatch, and same as last year's, I've kind of warmed to it a little bit, but I still can't find myself putting it on the top 10. I just can't. So I'd say this is probably number 12 or number 11. I'm not the nostalgia critics, therefore I'm not going to do the top 11. That would be infringing on his territory. So with that being said, No Time to Die is a very worthy entry in the franchise, but just not quite there. And now, on with the list. Live and Let Die. A lot of people might be surprised that I put Live and Let Die at number 10 and especially over No Time to Die. Live and Let Die is just more of a fun film for me, and it's very entertaining. The action is fantastic. It has a great villain, an interesting Bond girl, not quite the best, but not quite the worst. I think that all comes down to how Guy Hamilton directed Solitaire in these scenes. I think he gave Jane Seymour a great disservice in her film debut. But with that being said, speaking of debuts, Roger Moore really gives a solid turn as James Bond in this film. I don't quite like his fashion, but again, I don't like most 70s fashion or sets or anything like that. But there was a sense of good cheer and fun in this whole film, and I think that comes down to Tom Mankiewicz learning from his mistakes on writing the screenplay for Diamonds Are Forever, and I think this time he really tightened the screws and really tried to do something kind of unique, which was the location, and the villain himself was a change of pace, and as we talked about earlier this season, Yaphet Kotto was fantastic as Kananga, and he's surrounded by very interesting henchmen, and especially Baron Samedi is just a wonderful character and gives one of the best endings to a James Bond film I've ever seen. Oh, you gotta love it. Plus a great title song and a unique action chase, even though it's a little long. It also introduced us to Sheriff J.W. Peppa, the Louisiana State Police, who, hit or miss as he is, I gotta give credit to Clifton James for keeping it as dialed in as he did compared to The Man with the Golden Gun, where he was just absolutely told to let loose, much to the film's detriment. So, Live and Let Die is a very solid entry. I always love watching it, and I'll continue to love watching it in the future. Tomorrow Never Dies. I'll admit, when I was a kid, Tomorrow Never Dies wasn't quite my favorite. I liked watching it, no, don't get me wrong. But I was more into Sean Connery's films and some of Craig's entries, and I was more into Goldeneye than Tomorrow Never Dies. But watching Tomorrow Never Dies last year for the first season of Bond-tober was just such a enlightening experience. It's very ahead of its time in terms of its content, creating wars and stoking conflict with fake news and the media's influence on government and world events. And the villain is a deliciously over-the-top media baron, played by Jonathan Pryce and Elliot Carver. He just tells us that, but through his performance, that this is going to be a fun ride, but also a little bit of a sneaky, devious one that smuggles in a message underneath all the pomp and circumstance. I think Pierce was fantastic. Obviously, Michelle Yeoh was wonderful as Wei Lin, and they have a really wonderful dynamic. I just adore it. The action, as overstuffed as the film is with action, it's a lot of fun. It's very inventive. The car chase through the car park was fantastic with the BMW. The final battle on the stealth boat, the opening scene with the torpedoes that have to be pulled out before the place is blown to Kingdom Come. It's just a very fun movie, and I don't mind that there's one of those films that just is fast action and a very sneaky, but overall it's easy to follow plot, and it just does it so much better than other entries in the James Bond canon. And so Tomorrow Never Dies is one of those films that I hope people will give a second chance watch. They might find a bit of a surprise in the headlines. License to Kill. Okay, even when I was a kid, I knew License to Kill was absolutely fantastic because it it felt so grown up watching this one when I was a kid, and it was so different compared to what had come before. It was very close to On Her Majesty's Secret Service upon further analysis last year, but like I said, I didn't watch On Her Majesty's Secret Service till I was in high school, and so I didn't really know. So License to Kill felt very much like an outlier and very much like a game changer. I think at that time, Timothy's approach to the role, which was to go back to Fleming, was such a welcome breath of fresh air after the very stale final 3 films of Roger Moore. And one thing that I noticed on this one is this feels like John Glenn at his peak as a director. I think he had really, really wanted to deliver some great material for James Bond. I think he went to the school of Peter Hunt and Ian Fleming, but he was constantly at odds with the audience and Roger because they had come to accept Roger so completely with his antics and kind of the tone that had come before, that it was hard for him to really let loose and to really get back to the gritty and drama and the overall darkness that Fleming really brought to his books, especially the scene where Felix Leiter gets dismembered after his wedding. That's right out of Fleming. That actually comes from the book of Live and Let Die. And I just thought, like, ooh, cool. I felt like I was being challenged a little bit with License to Kill. Plus, again, Timothy Dalton was so great, and this was his most complete performance as Bond. And as I said earlier in the season, I love Pam Bouvier. I love the fact that Q gets to get in on the action for a little bit. That was a wonderful change and a pleasant surprise. I love Desmond Llewellyn finally getting to stretch his wings. And the final chase with the tanker trucks and Pam's airplane and Sanchez trying to chase Bond down with a machete that ultimately leads to a very bloody demise is one of the tip-top action sequences in all of James Bond. It reminded me very much of the truck chase from Indiana Jones, and that sequence, as some of you may know, is my favorite action sequence in all of cinema. So this one is actually pretty high up on my list too, I think, because of that. They were able to twist things around, add some very natural humor, I think. It didn't feel forced. License to Kill just is a great, solid, Fleming-like chapter in the Bond series, and I hope that people will recognize it as such and not count it out for feelings of previous years and previous reviews of the film. I hope that this one sees a little bit more of a renaissance in years to come, and hopefully its inclusion on my list will help. The Spy Who Loved Me. Well, what else can I say about this one? I mean, this one's considered god-tier, platinum-level James Bond. Now, it's in the middle of my list because there is a little bit of a pacing issue with this film, but overall, I found the film to be very enjoyable. It's very funny, it's witty. I love the dynamic between James and Anya. I thought that was great. Jaws, the menacing henchman with metal teeth, is just seared into people's memory of anybody who watches the film, I think. Plus, it has one of the best final battles in any of the James Bond series. I just think that this is such a great set by Ken Adam. I think this is the set that earned him an Academy Award nomination for Best Art Direction. Also, a little fun fact about the set is that Stanley Kubrick helped light the set because it was so gargantuan. This was the first ever use for the 007 stage at Pinewood Studios. And I think the fact that the stage was built solely for this film was really showing the filmmakers were coming off of the absolute roadkill that was The Man with the Golden Gun, and really wanted to push things. This is Cubby Broccoli's drive and determination coming right through the screen, and he picked the right people for working behind the camera, helped organize the right cast for it, and it was just the right way to go. And the shot that I think perfectly exemplifies the film and the intent behind it was that famous ski jump off the cliff and opening the parachute to a Union Jack and the Bond theme blaring in the background. I couldn't have done that better myself, I swear. Ergo, The Spy Who Loved Me is a very wonderful, solid entry in the Bond franchise and is one of the absolute best. From Russia with Love. For the second outing in the James Bond franchise, it had a lot to lose. It could have easily derailed the franchise before it began, because the plot of From Russia with Love itself is so labyrinthian and so convoluted that audiences at the time could have easily gotten lost if the filmmakers weren't careful. But I think it's because of that makes it such a enjoyable part of the viewing experience, not only for this film, but also for the early James Bond films, is that they took a lot of Fleming's work, which is pure espionage. I love that there's smoke and mirrors, there's ducking around corners, there's underground caverns with periscopes that you have to listen to get information. I love that there's a girl involved who you don't really know where her loyalties lie. You have some wonderful villains, a brilliant henchman played by Robert Shaw, and just an overall atmosphere of 60s spy glamour that it was really hard to come by at the time, and I think a lot of the films kind of lost after On Her Majesty's Secret Service. It took a long time for them to get that back. And you know, a lot of the credit too has to go to the fact that Peter Hunt was given carte blanche as editor to kind of rearrange plot elements that weren't quite clear. And I think the way he organized it was absolutely brilliant. You know, it's easy to follow, but there's still that suspense. Even on a rewatch, you just kind of feel a little unease going into every single transition or every single new wrinkle in the story. And it just makes for a dizzying cocktail of espionage and spy work. So, From Russia with Love is oft considered the best James Bond film. I think there's a couple that are slightly better, but this is one of the absolute best. On Her Majesty's Secret Service. I keep repeating this, but I do have to emphasize how misled I was in my youth about this movie. Everybody told me, oh no, that's the one where he gets married, it's bad, it's the one-time Bond, you can skip it and miss nothing. These people are out of their minds, because This really is one of the best of James Bond anything. I mean, I love the book. The movie itself is fantastic because director Peter Hunt had edited the James Bond films for all this time, and he really had a keen sense of Fleming's work. And I think that this novel really was a great opportunity for him to show what a great director he could be. And sadly, he directed a few films after this, but none reached the dizzying heights of this one. I love the villain's plan. It's devious, it's subtle, and you wouldn't piece it together unless you had to do actual spy work, just as James does in the film. It's not spoon-fed to him in a single monologue. There's bits and pieces everywhere, and he has to put it together. And add to that the very unpredictable element of this is the first time James Bond has ever fallen truly in love with somebody, with Tracy, played by Diana Rigg. As I discussed earlier this season, Tracy is a wonderful character. She's not just a supermodel cast into the film to give sex appeal. Diana Rigg is a lovely lady, but she's also a marvelous actress. And I think they were hyper-focused on giving Tracy a full character arc and character dynamic with James. And I think Rigg really helped George bring out the best in himself, considering it was his first film. And you really do buy the romance. I think the romance really works. Now, the film does have a few mistakes in it, such as, adhering closely to Fleming can lead to one or two scenes that maybe go on for slightly too long. Or there's some stylistic touches behind the camera which were very 1960s and never ever popped up again unless it was a homage or a pastiche in modern times. But again, what makes it great is that effort to not just create a glitz and glam story, but an actual meaty meal of action and romance and spy and espionage and action. I mean, the attack on Piz Gloria is probably my favorite action sequence in the whole of James Bond. It's beautifully shot, it's perfectly paced, and all the characters have something to do in there. They're not just there as decorations. And again, it has probably the most tragic ending of the Bond series. That and Casino Royale are tied for me. Just because we had grown to love Tracy and we could see why James fell in love with her. Thus, when she meets her untimely demise, it's just heartbreaking. It really is heartbreaking. And that was the first time, I think, in a long while that the Bond films took a risk. After that, because of audience reception at the time, particularly towards George, who I think was actually very good in the film, his offset behavior I find a little appalling. But he was wonderful, but at the time, people just couldn't accept that it wasn't Sean Connery, hence Sean's return for Diamonds Are Forever. And I think they were so dismayed by the lack of box office appeal because of how rich the film was in terms of story and character over the action and splendor, that it took a really, really long time for them to try to reintroduce that back. And I think that really happened around the time of Timothy Dalton, carried over a little bit with Pierce, but definitely reestablished with Daniel. So, on Her Majesty's Secret Service, please do not let this one pass by. Please give it a watch. It's one of those hidden gems in the Crown, and one of the absolute pinnacles of the Crown, in my opinion. On Her Majesty's Secret Service is a wonderful, wonderful movie. Goldeneye. This was a rebirth for the ages. After the less than stellar reception of License to Kill and a lot of intercorporate selling and buying and liquidation, the future of Bond was uncertain, and especially after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Glasnost with Russia, Bond was entering a different time than when he was conceived, and his longevity was now in question. But thanks to really smart writing and brilliant direction from Martin Campbell, and a really good lead in Pierce Brosnan, Bond entered the new age with such a brilliant bang. The action is marvelous. I love the story. I love the idea of revenge being played well in this film, especially from a former agent who is now turning against his friend and former government. I love the Bond girl for being kind of an ordinary woman thrust into an extraordinary situation and being able to hold her own. And this may seem a little childish, but this is still one of the most awesome moments in any movie for me. I love it. Cheers to that. But more than that, I like that Goldeneye was actually trying to give some more character depth than had been seen with Roger. I think Timothy started it. Pierce tried to carry it on to mixed results, as we'll see in the next episode. But Goldeneye is just a solid entry, and it was very popular for an absolutely perfect reason. It signaled, just as The Spy Who Loved Me signaled back in 1977, that Bond could adapt and overcome his challenges and stay relevant in the modern age. Goldfinger. It's the film with a Midas touch. I know what I did. I can't help it. Goldfinger's great.
But of course.
As I said in the previous seasons, if you want to see a more in-depth review of Goldfinger, either watch my episode about Goldfinger in the first season, or check out my podcast review of it with Parker a couple years ago, and you'll see just what a great movie this is and how influential it was in terms of cinema. This is a brilliant cocktail of fun action, along with a really intriguing plot, an intriguing villain played by Gert Frobe, a woman with one of the sauciest names in movie history, and of course it features Sean Connery's absolute peak mountain performance, as Bill Simmons would like to say. This is the movie where Sean was really at the top of his game as Bond. He ironed out all the kinks that had come before, even though I felt there were very few. And this is the film that really established James Bond as not just a passing fad, but something to be anticipated. It was something people would go bananas for, and they would stand around the blocks for hours to see in the theater. This movie really established the franchise and really kind of cemented Ian Fleming's legacy in the creation of James Bond, I think. Which I think is a wonderful tribute, considering he passed away not long before Goldfinger had come out. And he had gone through several legal wranglings with Kevin McClory, in which he was accused of plagiarism, and it's sad that he never got to really see Bond explode into this gargantuan world phenomenon. But it wouldn't have been a phenomenon had it not been for the quality of care taken by the producers and new director Guy Hamilton, who unfortunately would kind of wreck several films later on in the 70s, but this one, his direction was very much a breath of fresh air. He did seem to really understand and care what makes all the dynamics work, and I think he was really the one that made the Q-Bond relationship exactly what it is to this very day. This film is just so influential and ubiquitous in people's lists and in their minds of James Bond that what else could I really say except Goldfinger is a golden masterpiece in the James Bond series. Skyfall. I cannot tell you the anticipation I had for Skyfall going into it. With the announcement of Sam Mendes as the director, and looking at the trailers, seeing Roger Deakins' incredible photography, seeing the twist that they would take with James Bond as a character, and how M would be used, I was really excited. And Parker and I saw it in the theater, and I was just blown away by it. This is a marvelous James Bond film, and that it respects the past very much, but also shows how dangerous the past can be in reinventing the series for a new audience. And this one, I think, did it right. Spectre did it completely wrong. But this was a special film in that it felt like a big story. This wasn't just like Quantum of Solace, where they just thought, oh, well, we'll throw real-life elements in there and that'll be the driving force of the film. No, there was a modern twist to it in the use of computers and hacking and algorithms and all those things. But what it really came down to was the question of loyalty and the question of your past coming back to haunt you, or how you face the future when things go wrong, and especially encapsulating Judi Dench's marvelous performance as M. Just as I had mentioned in the previous episode that Javier Bardem was considered for an Oscar nomination for his portrayal of Silva, Judi Dench herself was also considered for a nomination for her performance as M, even though she had played it since Goldeneye. There really is a depth to these characters that we really not seen too much before, and it just pulled off with stunning aplomb. Plus, the photography is brilliant, the music is brilliant, Adele's song is magnificent. It's just a near perfect Bond movie for me. But as we'll see in number 1, my favorite, this one doesn't quite come as close, but Skyfall deserves all the praise that it gets. Casino Royale. Cheers to my favorite Bond film of all time. Being a kid in the early 2000s, you were starting to become aware of things more and more with the presence of the internet and how news outlets reported things. And so when we learned that this actor named Daniel Craig was going to replace Pierce Brosnan, I was a little sad because I had grown quite fond of Pierce, but I was still excited because, hey, it meant a new Bond movie was coming out. And I went to see the film with my brother and my dad, and I remember seeing it and just being in such shock by the film. It had not been the kind of overall fun romp that the films had kind of started becoming, especially Die Another Day was guilty of being this kind of jokey in-joke of a film. Now, with that being said, there is when I first came out, I didn't know what to make of this film. But I absolutely, upon a rewatch when we got the DVD, it seemed to confirm a suspicion in my gut that, Jim, I think this might be your favorite, and it is. It's got essentially perfect direction from Martin Campbell, based on Ian Fleming's book, which Casino Royale is a much better book than people give it credit for. It has a perfect Bond girl in Vesper Lynd, played by Eva Green, a perfect villain in Le Chiffre, and overall just a brilliant sense of action and cinematography and plotting. What other film have I ever seen makes poker suspenseful? Even for people like me who aren't very good at it. I mean, check this stuff out. Just great stuff. It also signaled a rebirth and a reboot of the Bond series going forward, that they were going to start fresh but still more or less respect their legacy. Now, some of the films didn't quite do this as well, but Casino Royale was a bountiful breath of fresh air for me, and every time I watch it, it just seems to get better and better. And I really do think that a lot of the people involved in the film should have gotten Oscar nominations. I thought this deserved a Best Picture nomination, frankly. Daniel should have gotten nominated for Best Actor, Eva for probably Best Actress. They campaigned her for Supporting Actress. I don't buy that. Campbell for Best Director, Phil Mayhew, Stuart Baird, David Arnold, Chris Cornell and David Arnold for You Know My Name, one of the best James Bond songs. This is the absolute pinnacle of James Bond for me. And it's going to take a lot to knock it off of that pedestal. And so, once again, cheers to Casino Royale, the best.
Yes. Considerably.
And there you have it, the top 10 best James Bond films of all time. Next week, for our season finale, we're going to be looking at the big one. The absolute biggest. The top James Bond actors. How are they ranked? Well, you're just going to have to tune in next week and find out. For now, I'm Jim Crowley. This is Bond-tober.